This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. This is going to be an interesting episode for some people, maybe less so for others. We're going to get into a lot of detail on metrics, on how to measure the effectiveness of certain cybersecurity controls. So this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to dive into the weeds a little bit, but I think it might be welcome after all kind of the industry drama of last week between the Dragos breach and the Rockwell Automation China controversy that the Wall Street Journal brought up, and some really crazy emails that other people sent me about, about some dramas in the industry. So I thought it might be fun to actually focus on something deep and technical. So if you like that, you're going to love this episode. If you're not into metrics, this might not be the episode for you. Fair warning. So with that, Liz, let's bring on Jake and Jay. My guests this time for this episode are Jay Johnson. He is a cybersecurity and renewable energy researcher at Sandia National Labs, and Jake Gentle, program manager, infrastructure security at Idaho National Laboratory, INL. Jake and Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, the reason I reached out to you was I read about a Department of Energy funded cyber resilience for wind installations project that you and the team, it was a bigger team I saw in the paper. You know, it was like 10, 12 people from both of the labs working on it. And the paper was entitled Hardening Wind Energy Systems from Cyber Threats. Now, I mentioned at the start that we're going to focus mostly on the metrics side of this, but I know in our pre-recording conversation, you felt it was important for the listeners to know why there's a focus on wind and renewables. So I don't know, Jay or Jake, which one of you want to take a swing as to why you thought this was a useful sector to focus the project on?
Yeah, thanks, Dale. So I do appreciate that opportunity to kind of lay the groundwork of how did we get here? Why are we here? Why are we focusing on certain elements of the wind industry? First off, we started this journey together back in 2019, where DOE's Wind Energy Technologies Office really got excited about cybersecurity, and they needed some guidance in terms of where to invest, how to focus. So between Idaho National Laboratory, Sandia National Labs, and the National Renewable Energy Lab, the three labs really combined to develop what we call, or what DOE ended up calling, the roadmap for wind cybersecurity. That's effectively something that doesn't necessarily strategize and give examples of how the industry should protect their systems. It's more of a roadmap, right, for laying the groundwork of where to start the research and development aspects from the Department of Energy's level. So in 2019, we identified that there's got to be some early stage cost benefit analysis work done on metrics for cybersecurity resilience, and what are the technologies that are already out there? What does industry already do, and what do they do really well? And then where do the national labs and university partners collaborate and partner with the sector to expose the renewable community, the wind industry specifically, to a lot of these techniques that they may not be deploying right now? And so if you think about what was our purpose, what were we really trying to do is, as Jay mentioned it, we were really just trying to create the platform or a gym to exercise some of this capability and see what works and see what doesn't ahead of any major adversarial activity. So to kind of set the stage of what is the wind industry look like, in 2022, there was more than 70,000 operating wind turbines. Now that's according to the USGS, US Geological Survey, and their wind turbine generator database. So that's a tool online. Anybody can go look up and see, where in the country these wind turbines are installed, the make, the model, the size. And just that point alone is something that we recognize may be a culture change that might need to happen over time, where you're not necessarily laying out where and how big each one of these turbines are, but maybe we kind of be a little bit more obscure in how we present ourselves moving forward. But with more than 70,000 of these wind turbines operating, it's producing more than 140,000 megawatts. 140,000 megawatts nameplate capacity. That's significant. And in 2022, there was more than, or at least close to 400 terawatt hours. 400 terawatt hours, significant. And what does that really relate to in terms of our electricity generated? Roughly about 10%, 10.2%, I think, is that total number in 2022. So we're, the renewables community, especially wind, is really tracking to be deemed critical infrastructure. And, the future, what does that look like? Well, the Biden administration's goal of installing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind is another major influx, infusion of wind generation into our power grid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the trend line's clear, right? And as I told you in the preview, I think the audience knows this is an important sector, and it is different than traditional power generation where you had large plants, isolated large plants. So I think that's important. I would say, though, if you're a listener here who is not involved in the wind industry or the renewable energy industry, this project that you did at the labs really, I think, is highly applicable to any other sector, because one of the first things you did, you have to pick a sector, right? If you're going to create a representative system, you have to pick a sector. But when you start to look at the diagrams, you have a perimeter, you have external people accessing through that perimeter. Their roles might be different in the sector you chose. You had DMZs, you had PLCs, you had HMI. So in a sense, when I looked at the diagram, I said, well, if you change some names around here, they'd be similar, not identical. Every sector has its own unique issues, but I would encourage people to listen, even if they're not interested in the wind aspect of this or renewable energy aspect. So as you started this, one of the first things you had to do was create a representative system. So I see in the diagrams, the documents, that it's a system that has 30 wind turbines that are generating, I think it was 24 megawatts of power, nameplate power, all 30 combined, which makes sense. But then when you were actually laying this out, you had to assume an architecture and you had to assume components. Some of the components weren't ideal. Like you had Windows 7 computers, you had some other things. I don't know if you had two-factor authentication for your VPN, but you had to make some decisions as to how secure you were going to make this example. Jay, how did you decide this was the right level of security or resiliency to put in the system?
Yeah, it took quite a bit of time. We interviewed a number of site owners and operators to try and create as realistic representation of wind sites from the industry. And so, sure, the connections may be a little bit different for different sites, but we thought VPNs from wind site owner operators, a grid operator, and an OEM were pretty realistic into that DMZ where there was a jump host. And then from that jump host, they could authenticate and then reach the OT network with the wind turbine generators and also the wind site controller. And that was that Windows machine that you were talking about. And so that was basically our baseline topology that we started with. And then we added several different cyber hardening technologies on top of that to evaluate how well these tools would be able to detect and mitigate two different simulated attacks onto the environment.
We'll get into that, but I think, and I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just kind of curious how you decided. For example, one of the attacks is the Eternal Blue attack that you have, or vulnerability, and you had a Windows 7 system that would be vulnerable to that. So you had to make a decision. Did you get some sense as to where the industry was, like that this was would you call this a typical level of security maturity, or did you pick one that was intentionally stronger or weaker than what you thought was typical?
So we selected something that would have a vulnerability so that we could show what a new exploit would do to the environment, whether or not it's a Windows machine, Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows 11, whatever machine, doesn't really matter. And I don't think that was what we were trying to get across here. What we were trying to show is that there's some sort of vulnerability that's known to the adversary, and they are able to exploit that in the environment. And the details of, precisely what we selected for the equipment in our virtual environment, I think that's not really critical to the discussion.
Okay. I think it would be if you look at you then the next step was, so you created this network, this system with on-site components, remote components and such, and it looked very realistic. I thought you did a good job, and I give the team and the writers of the paper credit. They describe it in enough detail that you can get a real good feel for the technology and how it was put together. And then the next thing that I saw was you then created 2 attack scenarios. One remote, starting outside and connecting through the VPN, and one is if you were local on the OT network itself. So there had to be some correlation. You had to know that, I guess you had to create attack scenarios that would work if no additional security controls were in place. Was that the driver, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did have to assume some level of penetrability, right? If you just completely firewalled everything off and had your perimeter locked down, then the exercises would be kind of unfruitful, if you will. So we set up different layers of defense and had some of that opportunity to describe what is representative of the industry. And so, as Jay mentioned, we spent a lot of time working with different stakeholders across the community, going to different conferences, different working groups, presenting the reference architecture, and then also tracking globally some of the activities that were going on around the world, really, to understand what has been presented and what attacks have been achieved. And so we spent a lot of time thinking through what could be real. And I think that's where some of this work on the two different scenarios that you mentioned really drives into, there's different maturity levels of the industry. And so we wanted to be representative across a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They did seem realistic, especially the remote one was, something that you've heard discussed many, many times in various stages in the kill chain. Why only 2 though? I was wondering when I saw that. I was like, clearly the team. I saw the people on the team. They could have come up with many, many more scenarios than 2. Is it a scaling issue? Is let's say 4 twice as much work as 2, or is there some sort of leverage you can get once on the attack side? I know there's a set amount of work to set up the environment, but
yeah, and I
what would it? I guess let me ask it as a question: if you were to go to 4 or 8, would that be 2 or 4 times longer, or is there some scale?
So I'll give you the depends answer real quick, and then turn it over to Jay on the deep technical side of what it would take. So the initial project was really creating the gym, the environment for which we could exercise a lot of these different scenarios. So once that environment is set up, then I think the scaling factor reduces. I don't think it takes as much time to create the scenarios and execute through them. I know when we were going through the final polishes of the paper and getting the report right, I think we redid several of the scenarios just to make sure we were capturing the time steps and the intervals in which different technologies would activate. So I wouldn't say it's 1 for 1. If you do 2, it's going to take a year. If you do 4, it's going to take 2 years. But for us, I think a lot of the time spent was interacting with industry. So Jay, I don't know if you want to expand.
Yeah, I think creating several different attack scenarios would be relatively straightforward, and we had an automated test framework for that, where we could basically just run a bunch of bash scripts that would call on, Python and other codes to execute all these things so that we could automate everything. But the bigger lift here was tuning, and I'm sure we're going to get into this later, but tuning like the SOAR responses and all the playbooks to respond to these different attacks and show if everything was tuned up on the defensive side, how it would respond. So it was less to do with the generating different attack scenarios and more to do with how do you actually rack and stack the technologies and make sure they're operating correctly. So that was actually the bigger lift, in my opinion.
Yeah, I did have some questions on that. So we've got an environment, we have an attack scenario, and then you came up with some metrics to say, okay, how are we going to measure the success as we deploy different security controls? How are we going to measure the effectiveness of the security controls? The first one I saw, and I was really pleased to see that you put in this, was a physical resilience score. And I understood half of it, and the other half is probably because I stopped being an electrical engineer after my freshman year. I didn't particularly take to that, but there was a power production loss. So basically, there's a nameplate amount of energy that can be created. You talked about you would include wind forecasts and such to adjust that, but there's a certain amount of power that you expected to receive. And if you got less than that, you got a lower score. But then there was also something called voltage resilience. And I don't know if it's important, but I couldn't understand what the voltage resilience, from kind of a big picture, what that was trying to capture.
Yeah, so essentially you need to maintain your grid voltage close to nominal, or else you get into situations where you could damage pumps or damage equipment and things like that. And so utilities typically try to maintain voltages within plus or minus 5% or 0.05 PU. And so this metric was just a quadratic function on the delta V of the power system, so that if you were deviating from that nominal voltage level, you had a quadratic penalty as you moved away from that. And so probably not too interesting to people that aren't power engineers, but it was another way to score how the adversary was impacting the power system.
Yeah.
Go ahead. But I was just going to say that this was so important. We see this so rarely. And I don't know if, Jake, if you got any pushback on this, but in the end, we're not in a competition to provide the best cybersecurity, right? We're in a competition to meet the mission of the system that we're trying to protect. And that's why I thought, I don't have enough knowledge of the area to say whether these were good metrics or not. The production one makes sense. Jay, the way you described it, the other one made sense too. But it was so refreshing to see that we are going to try to capture in our experiment the end goal of this. How does this cybersecurity affect our ability to do the mission that this physical infrastructure was there to go? But you had a comment on that, Jake, as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that we, in this study, we focused a lot on the control system, the ability to monitor and control the turbines in the plant level. But at the same time, we are grid tied, right? We are producing power to the electric grid, and we want to maintain a reliable source of power. And the variability of wind allows for a lot of unique control features inherent to the design of these wind plants, where an adversary may not have as high of success in influencing power disruptions, because the wind does that on a daily basis, right? The wind speed and direction are changing all the time. And so what we wanted to do is be able to look at the physical attributes of a single turbine and a single plant level performance. So yes, you can look at power, but you could also look at voltage and frequency. You could look at power factor and other things as well. But we wanted to make sure a lot of the physical attributes of the power plant was included in some of these metrics, just in case those who are kind of questioning if they were looking at packet capture loss or something else, that they were like, the whole point of the power plant is to produce power. So we needed to make sure we were tracking that within the same simulation environment that we were tracking a lot of the digital signal and data management.
Yeah, and I won't ask you to comment on it, although you're welcome to, but I think what you did with this metric is highly applicable when we see something like Oldsmar. And that attack there, while the cyber resiliency score, which we're going to get into next, might be extremely low, the physical resilience score would have been almost unaffected. There was no way they were going to deliver bad water, or be unable to deliver good water to their customers, even if they lost that whole thing and this command was sent forever. The physical system wouldn't have allowed that. And we seem to, in our industry, we really miss that issue, and we're focusing on these things that really aren't important. So I was thrilled to see that. On the cyber resilience score, this is a tougher one. Okay. And we might, I'd be curious if you were happy with the score. I think you deserve huge credit for trying to come up with a score. It's a very difficult problem. And I think we're going to get some less than perfect scores before we really nail these things down. But as I understood your cyber resilience score, is you put in some security controls, and then you saw for each step in the kill chain, it was either stopped or not stopped. Is that accurate, or would you define it a different way?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in the real world, right, you can't do this because you don't have a priori knowledge of every step that the adversary would go through to execute their full kill chain. But in this case, we knew every step for these scenarios. And so we could generate a score for the different hardening topologies that would essentially say, hey, if you stop your adversary at step 1 of their kill chain, your resilience is much higher than if it executes the full length of the kill chain, which I actually have it up over here. The remote attacker kill chain was 8 steps and the local one was 5. And so you basically go through these steps, and if you sever the kill chain halfway through, your resilience is like a 50% score.
Oh, I was thinking you were looking at each step, but that doesn't, well, the way you say it makes a lot more sense. Is you basically, if you stopped it in step 3, you got on the remote, the 8-step remote, you got credit for all 5 just because it never got to those steps,
That's
which
right.
makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. I think that's interesting. I wonder though, I guess that addresses my concern a little bit, that whether you were getting enough credit for stopping it. Like if it didn't succeed, I guess, let me think of a better way to put this. Should each kill chain step be scored the same? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think the bigger thing here is if you prevent something, the adversary is just going to select a different tool out of their arsenal and deploy that.
Okay.
So the likelihood of them like, oh, look, we stopped on step 2. There's no way to possibly compromise the system. That's not realistic. So there's, the pathway is not linear as described here in this research. It branches out. And so a true adversary is going to select between, different options to further compromise the system. So I think
that's a good point.
recognizing the limitations of what we did and being forthright about that.
No, I hadn't thought of that it might not be scoring it appropriately for this exact scenario, but that does address an earlier question I had, is, are you looking at other scenarios? In a way you are, because you're saying if you get to step 6, then you're going to be able to try to do 7 and 8 a number of different ways.
Yeah,
which
right.
is really interesting. Okay, cool. And people can look at the math at this. You get somewhere between 0 and 1. 1 being you did everything right, 0 being you did everything wrong, both on the physical and the cyber resilience scores. And the paper shows them sometimes as 0 to 1 and sometimes as a percentage. But I think the audience is able to handle that math. Even I am. Okay, so then now let's get to the really cool stuff. And maybe I didn't highlight this earlier enough, but what I really saw this project being is saying, we have all these security controls. So let's try to measure which ones actually are making a difference. So you had the system, the attacks, and then you had a total of 5 different topologies that you ran these through, and you scored them. The first one being nothing additional. Now this wasn't nothing because there were some patches applied. There was a firewall in place. There was a jump host and such. So there was some security measures in place. I actually thought it might be interesting to strip everything out and just start from 0. Like what kind of reduction do you get if you put that firewall in there? But the first one that was really applicable, applying something new, was Topology 2, where you put in encryption. You put in the Modbus wrapped in TLS, Modbus Secure. You called it, I think, something else like Modbus WTG or something like that. But I always think of that as Modbus wrapped in TLS, and you put in some access control. And that was quite effective, wasn't it? Especially on the physical resilience score only was down like 4% on that one. That was incredibly effective at keeping the plant up and running. Did that surprise you at all, how effective that was?
Yeah, I think it's interesting where, with these pre-programmed attacks that we were running, where the kill chain was actually severed. And yeah, in this situation, despite not having any sort of intrusion detection system or nice seam where you can see what's going on in the environment, just adding that encryption there was able to prevent the local, I think it was the local attack, or maybe the remote attack. I'd have to look back.
The remote attack.
From compromising the turbines themselves. And so the approach that was taken in what we're calling baseline topology 1, was not effective for that second one. So I think, yeah, I mean, it was a cool discovery to see, where in the process these different hardening technologies really shine. And so different ones were more effective in different places.
Yeah. So in that case, the physical resilience was at 96%, so only a loss of 4%. And the cyber resilience did much worse. It was at 46%, which was 8% higher than before it was put in. So you got a small bump in the cyber resilience score by putting in the Modbus encryption and the access control. But from what are we here to do, you really got something. In fact, I would say my reading of the document, and this surprised me a little bit and could be limited to the approach, maybe if you expanded this, we get different answers, was your best investment was in putting that encryption in. Because when you go down to your ROI calculations, it was by far the leading one because of it didn't require a lot of human interaction like your SOAR did or other things. So that was a little bit of a surprise to me that it scored so much.
Yeah, I will caution though by doing, I guess there's always trade-offs, right? So if you encrypt that communication, some of the NIDs or network-based intrusion detection systems will not work as effectively because you're not seeing the Modbus traffic natively. And so if you have a new write command on some sort of control function that you normally didn't see in the training data, then you can't detect that. And so, yeah, awesome. The encryption worked here, but you take a hit if you also want a NID stool in your environment.
Right. And you also noted, I think, and this ties to something that you said earlier. I thought I took a note on this, but there was a note that you said this was a case where it was stopped basically at the last step in the kill chain. And you said that the attacker might try to do something with the certificate infrastructure or something else to get around this. So this might be one of those cases where you've let them get all the way in. They just couldn't do the last step. And maybe with enough time, they would figure that out.
Yeah, I think at this point, right, I'm trying to look back here. Yeah, at this point, you've compromised the Windows machine, and that Windows machine had been communicating to the wind turbine devices, right, the wind turbine generators. So in theory, you would be able to extract the certificates and keys from that device and then complete the kill chain as we have it described here using that. But, there's a lot of things that could happen.
Yeah. I mean, it was an interesting characteristic. Now, I wondered why. We'll get into the other topologies that are more NIDs and SIM and SOAR and that sort of thing. But why didn't you run more topologies? Like you could have run encryption separate, remote access separate. I would have thought that might have been something that would be really cool just to then you'd get more individual results and mix and match results. But you picked 5. Was that just a time limitation, or what did you run into there?
Yeah, it was primarily a time and bandwidth limitation. So each of these environments are full-scale cyber-physical simulations. Every single device in this is a VM running real time, and you can log in and interact with it. The power simulation was from PowerWorld using the 2000 bus ERCOT model. And so it's just a lot of upfront effort to get the environments constructed appropriately with all the tools working together, and then run through these scenarios. Now that we have this, and actually we've open sourced a good majority of this environment, I think the door is open for doing a lot more scenarios, trying different hardening technologies, applying different attack scenarios as you've been describing. And so there's a lot more. I think this was mainly a proof of concept and exploring some new ideas. But now I believe we have a pretty good path forward for doing a lot more with this.
Okay, let's jump to topologies 3 and 4. So topology 3 had a NIDS, network IDS, and a SIM. Topology 4, I think, had, let's see, I'm looking, that had a SIM and HIDS and encryption. So, but the interesting thing on both of these was that there was a section there that really tied the human actor into this, which just shows now we're adding another layer of complexity onto these projects and these metrics, because you're saying if the human actor was closely monitoring the SIM, they may be able to block the attacker before step 3 in the kill chain. Similar with the NID. So you've got this thing where this control that you put in place could score really highly if you assume that the human actor is able to respond in time. What was that time? That was the thing that was unclear in the paper, is like if they could respond in 5 minutes, 10 minutes during their 8-hour shift, or what were you thinking there?
Right. Yeah. So it's whatever time it takes the adversary to develop the next step of the kill chain, I think, right? And so, well, I can speak from our team. It took us roughly 3 days to put together this sequence of exploits or attacks in the kill chain. So whatever the math works out to be, you've got an indicator of compromise somewhere in a NIDS or HIDS, and is alerting you that there's something going on. So whatever it takes that SOC operator to see that and respond to that has to be done before the next step of the kill chain to kill off that attack sequence at that point. Oh, well, and they need to know what to do, how to respond. What, do you just isolate the entire system? Do you try to, revoke somebody's access controls? It's difficult, probably from a single alert, to know exactly what's going on, but at least you could trigger the incident response team and hopefully mitigate the situation at that point.
Well, and Jake, how did the team come up with any conclusions as to how they should deal with this human factor when it comes to scoring? I mean, did you think about bucketing people or creating some human metric? I didn't see that there. I wouldn't have an answer either, but I'm curious if the team had come up with any thoughts.
Yeah, so part of this project, right? I mean, we could have gotten into human test subjects, if you will, right? Let teams actually be a part of the scenario that we're working through, and give them some time, right? I don't know how much Red Bull or Mountain Dew or whatever else they would need to stay up all night and create the next attack. But one of the things we wanted to do is kind of generate what you think is an alerting function, a capability, so that they had the information they needed in a timely fashion, in a form factor that allowed them to respond. So as part of the Playbooks scenario, we also wanted to make sure we had a visualization platform. So what could they be seeing from the security operations center side that would help them quickly react if they were trying to defend? What would the next step be? So we didn't focus as much on the human response time as maybe we could in future studies. But I think that gets into a lot different sets of folks, right? So we've got cognitive psychologists working on this very thing here at the laboratories, and they're looking at ways to be better informed. But in this project, we didn't try and score the maturity level of the human or the team or the organization, as we informed kind of the scoring factor of how severe was that attack against maybe the defenders, if you will.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you can approach it from a few different angles. You could assume certain levels of human competence and response time, and then put those in. But those would just be swags at this point. What'd be really cool is if you could get some asset owner who is monitoring a bunch of these renewable energy systems to say, hey, you just got one more site to monitor, and put that in the SOC, and then your team play with them a little bit, and to call it a training exercise for them. They can get the training exercise on incident response, and just sometime over the next year, you hit them 3 or 4 times and just see how they do.
Yeah. So to that point, I'm glad you mentioned something like that, because we're always talking about ways to further the research and help industry, and it's not just the renewable or the wind, owner operators or the OEMs. It's also those first responders, incident response teams around the country. And so what we're looking for right now, and I would say we have found at least one industry partner, an owner operator who is very much interested in a full plant level interaction with the follow-on of this paper, this research. Really is looking at, okay, now can we take some of the mitigations and attacks into the field and see how the wind plant itself behaves given the scenarios we throw at it. So we're starting that process now. We do have industry partnerships, and we do have Department of Energy investments to kick some of that off. Now, everything is shapeable. So as those who are listening in, if they're interested in providing input to what would that scenario look like, or what are the key things to focus on, we're all ears. But I think as you kind of shared a nice idea of what could be next, that's exactly where we're headed with some of the current research.
Well, and I think as in terms of the metric, you would need to have some sort of expectation for human competence and human response time. And you could have different levels of that, but you have to assume something. And perhaps some of the projects you talked about, Jake, maybe that'll help inform what's reasonable there. Just like your initial design of the system, you don't want to deploy something that is optimal that isn't real world. So you want to try to find something that's realistic. Let's get to Topology 5. Now, this one, Jay, you kind of alluded to this earlier. Topology 5 had added a SOAR, and you had some playbooks in there where the responses were automated. If you see this and this, then do this and that. And a lot of it was, I believe, stopping people's connectivity based on seeing certain actions, that you would basically kick them off the network or not allow them to participate anymore or send commands or such. And that, just to get the scores on that. So Topology 5 bumped up a cyber resilience score to 76.9, which was quite high for this. And the physical resilience score was 96, which was the same as the encryption. And this one did not include the encryption. So you got up to that same level. Essentially, they were non-successful. They did not affect power quality or power production. But the issue would be you came up with this playbook for this attack scenario, or the 2 attack scenarios. How realistic is it to come up with playbooks that are this effective? Like, if you had tweaked that a little bit, would each playbook need to be tweaked, or is this something that's at least a little generic playbook?
It was a very specific playbook for this very specific attack. So this is one of the big challenges, I think, for people implementing SOAR technologies, is to create relatively generic playbooks that can capture a wide range of like attacks. And it's I mean, basically we just said, hey, if you see the eternal blue payload coming by, make sure to cut off whatever IP address issued that. And so it's fairly straightforward firewall rule that we were using there. Or in the case of the remote attacker, I think we were isolating using revoking credentials at the jump host. But yeah, it was very specific for this scenario. I don't want to overly, I guess, overstate the capabilities of the SOAR tool just out of the box. You have to tailor your playbooks to the events and situations that are specific to your environment. And so I think that yeah, it worked really, really well for us. But that was because we kept running through the exact same scenario over and over, and it was responding to the exact same thing over and over.
Yeah. And you captured this a little bit, and I think this was another excellent section in the report, but the one I would be most terrified to write myself, because I think section 6, which was expected benefit from cybersecurity investment, and you go through the math of this, but and you actually get to you say the annual corporate Winsight cyber investment should be $356,000, and this is based on losses and a bunch of other factors. So there are a lot of things in that section that are kind of leaps of faith, but I think we have to start there somewhere, so while I wouldn't be comfortable going up in front of a board and presenting, this is based on this analysis, this is where we should spend our money. But again, the effort to try to get that rigor is an important step for our industry. Were there any lessons learned as you went through that section 6 that you say this is something maybe that is really effective, or this is an area we need to do a lot of work on because we're not there yet?
This is where that partnership, right, with industry really comes into play. I think that's of the report, of the whole project. I think this is an area where a lot of work, a lot of collaboration could really benefit the whole community. Understanding that we had to do a lot of hand waving, if you will, to assign numbers, dollar figures to certain things. I think there's an opportunity to expand on this work. And at the end of the day, we wanted to provide a framework, right? Some sort of simplified calculation process that will allow those who know their exact numbers to plug it in to some standardized way of reporting the cost versus benefit.
Okay. Hey, Jay, did you have something?
Yeah, I'll say that absolutely this analysis is built upon a lot of assumptions in terms of periodicity of attacks, assumptions in terms of the cost of the tools that are being developed, assumptions in terms of the breach cost or the impact to the site, whether that's physical damage or some sort of lost revenue from not generating power when you have a power purchase agreement or something else. And so, yeah, I mean, we're sticking our necks out about yay long trying to do this, but I pressured the team a little bit to come up with some real numbers here and at least establish some sort of framework to have a discussion about this. And is this the right answer? Probably not, but at least it's a starting place. And I'm not sure if you're looking at the IEEE access paper or the final technical report, but we approached it slightly different ways in both of those. In the final technical report, we were trying to apply the Gordon-Loeb model, which essentially says that you should invest over some sort of time period, like 37% of your expected loss of a breach, and using that as the framework for which we could have the discussion. But academics want to talk about academic things, and so we gave it our best guess. But realistically, I think if you're on the board and have to make a decision about what to invest in, that's a whole different conversation.
Well, and I think sometimes people get hung up on the granularity. So you come up these approaches that you have come up with very specific numbers, and then you just have to say there maybe is the precision of that number is maybe broad, but we start to get into some broad strokes. I guess where I would love to see this project go, either by your team or anyone who picks it up, is I'd really like to see, if I had to choose one thing, obviously I'd like to see more scenarios and such, but if I had to see one thing, it'd be more of what you called topologies. Like I'd like to see the effectiveness of patching PLCs and panels. My guess is that's very low. We see a big push for asset inventory. It's unclear to me how having an asset inventory was going to help you a lot in this. Now, maybe if you say asset inventory alone, nothing, but asset inventory, but plus SIM, plus SOAR playbooks, but then you start to build up a cost around all that. And is that the best place to put your resources? So you could have a lot of fun with these topologies. And that, to me, I would love to start to see numbers on that, because quite frankly, that encryption thing surprised me. And I think it's a bit of an outlier because of what you said, is you could probably get around it. That's a tricky part, but I'd love to see more topologies is what I'd like. But as kind of a closing thought, I'll give both of you a chance. Was there something important about the project we didn't talk about? And is there an ask for the community that you wanted to put out there? And Jake, I guess we'll start with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I think one of the opportunities for everybody to learn quickly is gamification. How do you gamify some of these studies and these scenarios that we're all building? How can we get more input into those scenarios so that Team A and Team B are competing in a neutral environment, yet they're learning and we're all collecting information based on the capabilities of those two different teams? I know a different playbook will show up based on the assets, whether it be the owner operator, the OEM, that's different in each scenario, but also the red versus blue, if you will. The two teams may have different levels of expertise. And so for me, I think this project is great. We somewhat gamified it between the two laboratories, between Idaho National Laboratory and Sandia National Labs. But I think we would like to include more industry engagement as we go through these scenarios and these iterations of how the cost benefit calculation could be improved. And I know Dale, your pwn to own work is exactly one of the ways, I should say, of gamifying and improving cybersecurity for all stakeholders. It'd be interesting to see if there's a way to implement some of these academic studies, if you will, into kind of a industry engagement process.
And before we go to Jay, Jake, what's the best way if someone wants to reach out on you? Are you a LinkedIn guy, a Twitter guy? What's the best way for someone to find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. You can absolutely find me on LinkedIn. Pretty unique name, Jake Gentle. So if you're just familiar with Jake Gentle, jake.gentle@inl.gov, you can always email me and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Okay, and then Jay, you don't have a unique name. Jay Johnson there's a few of them out there. I looked you up on LinkedIn and I got a bunch of them. But why don't we start out? Is there something we didn't talk about or some ask you have to close things out?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about this, but I think that this was the first foray into this space of really exploring cyber hardening technologies for wind sites in a virtualized environment. I think where we would like to go in the future is trying these things out in the real world. So if there are asset owners out there that are willing to work with the national labs, we'd be thrilled to partner with you. We're very interested in getting hands-on experience and learning from field experiences. And the wind office at DOE is starting to dig in a little deeper into some of these technologies, looking at intrusion detection systems, both at like the host level and at the network level. And we're hoping to have quite a bit of follow-on work in the future. So keep your eye out for new good things coming out of the lab shortly.
Okay, well, that's good. We will. And if someone wants to reach out to you, is what's the best social you're on? I don't want to have you give your personal
LinkedIn,
information.
And I think it is J. Tilley Johnson is my LinkedIn.
Okay. Or Jay, if you just search, if you're a LinkedIn guru, Jay Johnson, and and Sandia. I'm sure you'll find him. So gentlemen, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for doing the hard work to try to put some numbers on these controls and cost benefit analysis. It's really appreciated. And I'll be watching what you do from here on.
Yeah, thank you,
for
Dale.
highlighting the work.
Yeah, thanks for providing a platform like this for the broader industry, if you will, to dial in and listen in. So